The Travels and Adventures of Little Baron Trump and His Wonderful Dog Bulger. Chapter 8, Part 7. I was summoned to approach the steps of the judge's chair. He spake as follows: When thou art taller, thou wilt be stronger. When thou art older, thou wilt be wiser. Know then that, as the abject slave of the child of the sun, him of the sacred countenance, Lord of all the orders, I had intended to dismiss this charge against thy dog, cast off his manacles, and set him free. But it may not now be done. Thy pleading hath convinced me that he doth deserve to die. A just cause needeth no other defense than words. But thou hast pleaded with hands and legs and feet. Thou hast been over earnest. 'Tis proof thou knewest the weakness of thy cause. Hadst thou not spoken at all, and had thy dog himself but opened his mouth at the very outset, what had fallen therefrom would have freed him from his shackles. Now he must die. Let him be delivered to the public executioner. And then, with a motion of his hand, he ordered the gongs to be beat so that it was impossible for me to make reply. The great chamber was now the scene of the wildest hubbub. The guards crowded round me as if they feared I might, in my desperation, sacrifice my life in attempting to rescue Bulger. Poor Bulger! He had been quickly lifted into his wicker cage and borne out of the courtroom. Although I could feel my heart hammering on my ribs, I gave no sign of the storm of emotions that was sweeping over my inward being. I could hear those terrible words, public executioner, ringing in my ears, but my infallible second sight caught no glimpse of that dreadful officer, and hence I felt that there was still hope. But I moved neither hand nor foot. The gongs ceased beating. The throng departed from the Hall of Justice. The guards, kowtowing, backed out of my presence. I stood there alone in the vast, silent chamber. I was aroused at last from my deep reverie by the approach of a messenger from Keen Chop. He thus addressed me: The wretched little misshapen Keen Chop humbly begs the tall and stately stranger to drink tea with him in his private apartment. Mechanically, I followed the judge's servant, who led me through a long and winding corridors. Keen Chop had laid off his huge spectacles and received me most graciously. All the servants were dismissed. We sipped our tea in silence for a while. At length, rising and stepping behind a screen, he returned, bearing a huge volume. It was the record of Bulger's trial. He desired me to examine it while he refreshed himself after his long sitting on the judge's bench with a short nap. I turned the leaves of the record over slowly. Not only were my words set down with the most perfect accuracy, but correct drawings of the various scenes filled the broad margins of the record. On the last page, I noticed that a blank space had been left between the words must and die, and him and be delivered. "'Tis miraculous!" exclaimed Keen Chop, starting up and rubbing his eyes. "What a wonderful creature is thy dog! As I slept, I dreamt that he oped his mouth, and what fell therefrom convinced me of his innocence." "Let him be brought into your august presence, O just judge," I replied. In a few moments, Bulger's wicker house was deposited on the floor, and he was lifted gently out of it. I could only with the greatest exertion keep back the tears as his large speaking eyes were turned full upon me, as if to ask, "When will all this mystery come to an end, little master?" I stroked his head with a loving hand to assure him that all was right. No sooner were the attendants out of the apartment than, taking the purse of gold which Bulger had picked up on the beach and restored to me, I placed it in his mouth and made a sign for him to carry it to Keen Chop, who had now resumed his huge spectacles and sat poring over the pages of the record of Bulger's trial. Bulger did not wait for a second bidding. Making straight for Keen Chop, he raised himself on his hind feet and dropped the purse in that dignitary's lap. "'Tis wonderful, 'tis very wonderful," cried Keen Chop, testing the weight of the purse, with a pleased expression of countenance, first in one hand, then in the other. "Thy speech was silveren, but his silence is golden. 'Twere a crime to part two such faithful hearts. Go in peace." "But the record of the trial?" I asked. Keen Chop spoke not, but turning to the last page, he laid his finger on the place where the blank spaces had been left. They were now both filled. The word "not" had been written in each of them. The guards were now summoned, and in a few moments the shackles were loosened from Bulger's feet. Upon finding himself free once more, he leapt into my lap with a wild cry of joy and covered my hands and face with caresses. I could not keep the tears back. Clasping the faithful animal convulsively in my arms, I wept like a child. But a cloud came over our joy, for Keen Chop, upon my request for a safe conduct to the nearest seaport, informed me that he was powerless to grant my request, that I must apply to Slim Lim, the Tao Tai, or imperial governor of the province, lord of the peacock feather, knight of the plain red button, etc., etc. "'Tis well," I exclaimed. "Deign to send one of thy servants to conduct me into the presence of his honor, the Tao Tai. I pine to set foot once more on my native strand. I long to put an end to the sorrowful anxiety of my parents." Keen Chop shook his head and smiled sadly. "Know, O honored guest," said he, "that no one may approach the Tao Tai, lord of a peacock feather, unless, in answer to most humble petition of 20 pages length, his high and mighty lordship deign to accord an audience. To attempt to do otherwise might mean death at the hands of the gods, but would most surely mean imprisonment in the deepest dungeon of the imperial fortress." "So be it," I replied. "Come death, come imprisonment. I stand this day in the presence of Slim Lim, the Tao Tai, knight of the plain red button, and lord of the peacock feather." Keen Chop groaned loud and deep, but seeing that I was resolved to set out at once for the governor's palace, he sent one of his attendants to conduct me to the gate, instructing him, in case the guards raised their swords to slay me, to cry out in a loud voice that I was a harmless lunatic and had escaped from my keepers. To end all opposition, I consented to this. Whereupon Keen Chop bade me an affectionate adieu, and followed by my faithful Bulger, I turned my steps toward the palace of the Tao Tai. To tell the truth, chaos reigned within my mind. In as many seconds, 20 different plans of action occupied my thoughts. How shall Bulger and I overcome the opposition of armed guards? It will be madness to provoke them to use their weapons upon us. If I am fated to stand in the presence of the Lord Tao Tai, it must be accomplished by ruse and stratagem. Luckily for me, the shades of night now began to fall, for although the gateway and corridors of the governor's palace might be illuminated by 10,000 lanterns, as in truth I found them to be when I reached them, yet the light they shed was soft and uncertain. Counting upon the almost lightning celerity of my movements and the utterly noiselessness of my steps, I succeeded quite easily in flitting by the group of sentries who were stationed at the outer gate. Delighted with my good fortune, I sprang lightly up the steps of the portico and, closely followed by Bulger, strode into the main corridor with dignified mien and stately air. 8 towering fellows, armed with savage-looking pikes, for one of whom it would have been no more trouble to split me and toss me out of the window than for a boy to impale a frog on the end of his pointed stick and toss it on dry land, now blocked my advance. So noiseless had been my step that I had approached within a few feet of them before they became aware of my presence. Had I dropped from the clouds, their astonishment could not have been greater and more ludicrous to behold. They clutched each other by the arm, leveled their index fingers at me, and whispered in a hoarse voice as one man, "A little devil!" "Nay, my good men," I replied with a most gracious smile. "Not a little devil, but a soldier like yourselves, one who has fought 'neath many skies, knows what a good sword is, what good wine is, would rather fight than run, can tell a good story, and loves war as a hunter loves the chase." The 8 men looked at each other, tapped their foreheads significantly, and then fixed their gaze upon me, as if they were in doubt whether my next move would be to jump down their throats, vanish into thin air, or expand into an awful ogre and gulp them all down without pepper or salt. "Come, comrades," I called out in a careless tone, "lay aside your pikes, and I'll show you something that I picked up on a battlefield in the war against the Algerines. Something so curious that if you had not slept a wink for 3 months and a day, you would still be willing to keep awake and examine it." Saying this, I drew my musical snuff box out of my pocket and, tapping its lid mysteriously, tiptoed my way toward the outside entrance of the corridor and beckoned them to follow me. They did so with the most comical expression of half wonder and half curiosity depicted on their faces. But first, they quietly set their grim-looking pikes in the rack against the wall. Motioning them to lay their heads together and bend down so that they could see and hear, for I reached about up to their girdles, I touched the spring of the snuff box, and it began to play. It is impossible for me to give you any idea of the delight which shone upon their great, round, smooth faces. Their mouths fell open. Their fingers twitched nervously as if they longed to touch the little wonder and yet dared not. I felt now that the moment had arrived for me to act. Winding up the snuff box to its utmost limit, I thrust it into the hands of one of the guards, who seemed beside himself with joy, and showed him how to touch the secret spring. As the music began again, they closed up their group so tightly that even if I had wished to remain one of the circle, it would have been an impossibility. To my infinite satisfaction, they now seemed to dismiss me most unceremoniously from their society. More quickly than it takes to tell it, I drew a ball of strong twine from my pocket, and fastening the ends of their queues securely together, I retreated to the outside entrance of the palace and placed the other end of the string between Bulger's teeth with a motion that meant, "Stand fast and pull hard." In another instant, I had passed the group of guards and was making for the door of the audience chamber. Suddenly, the enormity of their negligence dawns upon them. They look up. They see me already at the end of the corridor. They drop the enchanted box, which has decoyed them from the path of duty. They start toward their pikes. Some mysterious force holds them chained to the floor. Bulger is doing splendid work. My hand is on the door of the audience chamber. Smitten with a superstitious dread of some unseen power, the guards stand rooted to the spot. A low whistle tells Bulger that his task is complete. He flashes through the corridor like a spirit. We enter the vestibule of the audience chamber. We pass through an outer apartment. We stand in the presence of Slim Lim, Lord of the Peacock Feather. Slim Lim was at home. He was seated in the center of the spacious apartment, sipping a cup of very fragrant tea, the aroma of which was so fascinating that I paused and inhaled it with all the gusto of a fine taster. 2 ladies, clad in robes of great beauty and richness, were busy brewing tea and spreading before the Lord Tao Tai an infinite number of delicate viands and toothsome tidbits. But he ate nothing. He was evidently somewhat disturbed by my sudden appearance, and I could see that one thought, to the exclusion of all others, was occupying his mind. It was, how did this stranger pass the guards? True, he is small, but if he can calmly walk into my apartment, why may not an evil-disposed person do likewise? Determined to convince Slim Lim and the ladies of his household of my noble lineage and refined manners, I kowtowed with all the grace of a veteran courtier, and began the enumeration of their various virtues, excellences, and charms of body and mind. When I had reached number 117, the victory was complete. They smiled, but Slim Lim remained obdurate. He gazed into vacancy for several moments and then pretended to fall asleep. I recite the purpose of my visit and waited patiently for the Lord of the Peacock Feather to deign to reply. He did so at last, but without opening his eyes, speaking as if half in a dream. And we'll pause here and continue with this story in the next video. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment below. Thanks so much for watching. I love you guys. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.